Welcome to day 4, everybody, to the Kids Chance National Conference. I'm hoping everybody is enjoying this year's conference. Last week, we opened with some inspirational words from Bob Ballard, CEO of Scholarship America, followed by the great perspectives from our current president, Ken Martino. We had a day devoted to building community, and I believe there were takeaways that everyone was able to benefit from. Friday, of course, brought our Clyde Award recognition and our annual meeting with an astounding report out from our state members. I believe we reached a new record of states reporting, and the highlights were just absolutely terrific. I know I'm prepared for the next trivia night with all kinds of information and details about each and every state. So some housekeeping items we always start to. I'd like to introduce to you our tech coordinator extraordinaire, Linda Howard. If you haven't seen her waving from the background, she is here. Linda will be providing direction throughout the conference, and just watch for those kinds of things in the chat box. Linda's information will be there. If you need support at any time, just put something in the chat and we'll be happy to accommodate. As we dive into the final 2 days of the conference, we'll be focused on strengthening governance and building sustainable organizations, something we all, I think, need to be aware of both at the national and at the state level. Day 4 will begin with a look at our boards and our leaderships, followed by an examination of corporate responsibilities and culminating in a discussion around volunteer engagement. I think remembering the words of Bob Keefe on Friday, Kids Chance is an organization of volunteers. So we need to be sure that everyone is well informed, well prepared, and well engaged. We will focus on some of the best practices we may already use and help us to begin to elevate our expectations to achieve more than we may have imagined when it comes to volunteers and leadership. Strong organizations start with strong boards. These sessions will help guide you into making that a reality. So on behalf of Kids Chance and all of our volunteers, I'd like to thank our conference sponsors for their support and their participation in making the 2021 virtual conference a success. And I'm going to take a moment to read these. That's Sedgwick, Paradigm, MedRisk, My Matrix, Optin, MedData, Select Medical, Healthy Systems, Care Risk Partners, Coventry, Concentra, Conduit, we've got a lot of C's, Care Risk, Coventry, Concentra, Conduit, Helmsman, Alliance, Japari, NCCI. And I think there's one there on the end that I can't see in the sponsor sign. Linda, what does that say?
Work Comp ED.
Work Comp ED. So not to be forgotten, all of these conference sponsors have made today possible, and they also provide support to our ongoing educational programs throughout the year. So thank you to everyone. It's time for the student spotlight. For those who have been following along, this will be the 4th in a series of student testimonials that we've been sharing throughout the conference. Today, we will spotlight a student and her family who've been touched by both the tragedy of a workplace death for one parent and the threat of COVID-19 and breast cancer for another. Certainly more trauma than any one child should have to endure. Allie shares how the scholarship has helped her through. Thanks again to Bob Wilson for interviewing our students and producing these videos. Take it away, Bob. We're not going to take it away. If this is where I'm supposed to do my soft shoe, nobody put that in the script. So I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. Look at all these people. Maybe what we'll do is move past this and come back to the student spotlight in a moment. Can we do that? Okay. I expect everyone has enjoyed the pre-conference swag boxes. So I want to make sure that Mission Control has been able to
how to work related.
help with all of the back end things. We've tried to integrate some fun time through the funny faces and the Kids Chance t-shirts and have worked our way through the conference. This would not have been possible without Helmsman. Helmsman has been our sort of back end swag box sponsor, so I wanted to be able to give them a little bit of a call out. Helmsman blends advocacy, expertise, and innovation to reduce the impact of costly injuries on your employees and businesses. The flexible, holistic approach to workers' compensation stands out. Helmsman's goal is to always empower their employees to make your people and business whole again. To achieve this, they provide access to extensive resources, unmatched expertise, and innovative solutions. And they encourage compassion. So thank you again to Helmsman for sponsoring our swag boxes and making those wonderful props available to everybody who's going through. Okay, we're going to move into track 2 today, which is all about strengthening governance. What does that mean and what does that include and exactly what is entailed? We have a number of speakers in track 2 that will help to answer those questions for us, beginning with our keynote sponsor of the day. But first, let me thank our keynote sponsors who have made her participation possible. First, let me thank MedData for their sponsorship of the next keynote presentation. MedData is the premier provider of cost management software and service solutions for insurance carriers, self-insured companies, third-party administrators, state funds, public entities, and workers' compensation and auto liability industries. Let me also thank Healthy Systems, who is also part of our keynote sponsorship today. Healthy Systems provides innovative solutions that help workers' compensation payers effectively manage the overall cost and quality of medical care in the injured worker. The comprehensive pharmacy benefit management program integrates clinical logic, advanced analytics, and innovative technology to proactively address medication risk and other drug therapy drivers. For more information on Healthy Systems, please visit their website at www.healthysystems.com. So without further ado, I'm going to move to our featured keynote speaker for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Crystal Thompkins. Crystal is the head of philanthropic solutions and is responsible for philanthropic strategy for all wealth management at BNY Mellon. In this role, she's responsible for managing the client relationship teams in Boston, Massachusetts, and Greensboro, North Carolina. She also works directly with large, complex clients on all aspects of their giving programs and coordinates resources throughout BNY Mellon to provide support and expertise. Crystal, and it's been delightful getting to know Crystal and really the BNY Mellon program, which I think has a phenomenal position within the nonprofit space, working with both boards and nonprofits. So I think we're really lucky to have her here with us today. Crystal will be talking to us about the leadership factor in the future of giving, and I'm anxious to hear what she has to say. So Crystal, I'll let you take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Vicki, and good day, everyone. Greetings from sunny North Carolina. I saw a couple of names pop up in the chat from my fellow North Carolinians. So hi, stop by. I'm in Greensboro on Elm Street. Anytime you're nearby. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today as part of what looks to be a fantastic conference. I hope I can continue that with this keynote opportunity. And I do want this to be a really engaging and interactive session. So please be sure to use the chat box to ask questions or share your insights and perspectives, because that actually drives the conversation and helps get everyone's thinking caps on. I'll try to answer questions throughout, but I'll also try to leave a few minutes at the end as well. And this deck will be available to you after the session, so you can refer to it as needed. So now that we've got, I think I've covered all the logistics, but if I haven't, Linda will let me know. Now that we've got those logistics out of the way, I'm going to dive right in by talking about the current giving climate, because that's what really is driving the future of giving. So next slide, please, Linda. So we've casually used words probably like, and phrases like unprecedented and once in a lifetime over the past year. And in fact, the past few years, there's been a confluence of events that make this a really, really unique time. Specifically, in the world of charitable giving, there's been this trifecta of accelerated disruption, shifts in demographics, and the growing impact of social finance and social investing that have created challenges. The impact we don't even know the extent of at this point, but there's also, they've created opportunities for both donors and nonprofits. Of course, we can't talk about disruption without talking about COVID-19. The global pandemic has impacted everything in ways both known and yet still to be determined. And nonprofits are facing challenges never before faced with the lack of resources to support mission, to trying to meet the demand for services, to trying to figure out entirely new revenue streams. We could do an hours-long session on that alone and still probably just scratch the surface, but it suffices to say that COVID has forced change in a way that we've not seen before. Would be just a second. I'm frozen. Okay, next, we've witnessed extraordinary social and economic unrest. And movements for social and racial justice and equity have been in the spotlight, and people are deploying capital to address these issues with excuse me. Oh gosh, I'm frozen. Address these issues. And with the backdrop of COVID, they've highlighted the size of the holes in our social safety net, and especially the impact to underrepresented communities that have really led to more intention and thoughtfulness when we think about values and what's important. Charitable giving has, for many people, been not just a way to do good, but also a way to right wrongs. Bear with me just a second. I apologize, I'm frozen on.
You know, this is, sometimes this happens in virtual meetings and events. Must be something in the air today. Crystal,
we will adjust and adapt.
That's right.
So this, of course, now, we've got the backdrop of COVID, and then we've got the social and economic unrest that has been challenging our country. And then, of course, there's the good old government that steps in with legislative changes. And those include the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the Secure Act, and the CARES Act that have impacted the tax benefits of charitable giving. So that has created an entirely different set of issues for nonprofits and donors alike as they try to navigate what's happening with taxes and how COVID has impacted that. And now we've got looming questions about tax legislation in the roads ahead and how that could impact charitable giving, with income and capital gains taxes increasing potentially. How will deductions be impacted with both standard and itemized deduction, and what does that mean specifically for charitable giving, and all the way to the deductions from a state and local tax perspective and how that impacts charitable giving at the state and local level. So, and the media focus has been primarily in the changes proposed for individual income tax to a great extent, but there's also going to be some impact potentially for corporate tax giving. And if corporate tax rates go up, what might that mean for the level of corporate giving? We know that most people primarily don't give for tax reasons. We know that. The research, there's plenty of research out there that has explained that, but the tax impact of giving certainly does matter, and it's important to people who are giving and the nonprofits who rely on those gifts. So now let's talk about donor dollars and cents a little bit. And Linda, next slide, please. When we look at the philanthropic market through 2019, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Giving USA study that talks about 2019 as a banner year for giving, with over $449 billion in total giving, up 2.4% with inflation. And 2017 through 2019 were the highest giving years on record since the inception of this study back in the 70s. This is somewhat unsurprising when you take into consideration that total charitable giving has increased or stayed flat in current dollars every year since 1979. And there's only been 3 exceptions to the years that giving stayed, that giving saw declines. And those were 1987, 2008, and 2009, all periods where there was a recession. So what's probably unsurprising is that the majority of donors were also individuals at the top end of the wealth spectrum. Overall, the wealthiest continue to be generous with their charitable giving, and we'll come back to that nugget in just a moment. Also interesting, while the growth in the philanthropic market has been steadily increasing, one of the factors that impacts giving, GDP or gross domestic product, which makes sense when you consider that the majority of the economy, when you consider the impact of the ability to give and how it correlates with the strength of the economy, it tells an interesting story. Because even though we've reached these historic numbers in 2019 and 2017 through 2019 were historic in terms of total giving as a percentage of GDP hasn't been above 2.1% for over 40 years. Prior to that, it was always well above. So while the dollars have increased just in terms of sheer volume, it's still not on pace with the level of growth we've seen in gross domestic product. So we entered 2020 with this record-breaking year of giving, and then we saw all of these things happen with COVID and social and economic and racial justice coming to the forefront. So with that in mind, and looking back and thinking about what you learned from 2020, what do you think the numbers are going to land in terms of total giving for 2020? And this is where we're going to try to put up a poll and for the interactive part of our presentation. And I want to pose the question: how do you think giving in the philanthropic market will change from 2019 to 2020? Do you think it's going to increase? Do you think it's going to decrease? Do you think it's going to stay relatively the same? Or you have no idea and you just, anything at this point is speculation, but you'd rather not say and just would default to, I don't know. So just take a couple of seconds and let's try to submit your answers for the poll question. I'll share anecdotally, by the way, while we're waiting for the poll to be populated. Across our nonprofit client base for the first 4 months of 2020, giving actually was higher year over year from 2019, but then it trickled off for the remainder of the year. Our donor advised fund, the BNY Mellon Charitable Gift Fund, saw yearly highs both in funds and grants processed. And I have to say that, you know, even despite all of the tragedy that came about with COVID, some of the stories that were shared with me by our nonprofit clients about the generosity of donors last year, and I'm sure you have some of those stories to share as well. Those are the stories that make me love the work that I do. So with that, let's take a look at the poll results. So there's an optimistic crowd. I love it. 54% of respondents think that the change from that giving is going to increase from 2019 to 2020. And I hope that's coming from some experience within your own organization. But 21% think that there's going to be a decrease. And interestingly enough, there's a tie between folks that think it's going to be a decrease and it's going to stay relatively the same. So it will certainly be interesting to see how this all plays out when we get the data. We'll actually be sharing our clients' planned giving activity data and DAF results in our annual charitable gift report later this year. And so I'll be sure to get that in your hands so you can see some of that those numbers. But also the Giving USA data should be out in June and July. So stay tuned. But one thing we do know for certain, and that's that the industry disruption of last year resulted in a shift in donor behavior. While donors are still incredibly generous, as you've experienced and that I've experienced with working with our clients, there's still quite a bit of donor uncertainty. There's all the usual questions around giving. Which organizations do I give to? How much do I give? How do I give? Then all of these are still questions donors are considering, but now there's also additional questions resulting from what they know and what they don't know about what lies ahead. There's questions on the financial front. How is my future and my family's future going to be impacted by the tax changes or market and economic shifts? For the causes that donors care about, who needs my support the most? Am I contributing to help with a problem, or am I contributing to solve it? And these are the questions that we're getting and hearing from our wealthy individual and family clients. And these and many more are the questions that nonprofits are considering as well. I know Kids Chance has embarked on a really ambitious strategic plan to expand your impact by strengthening relationships with your key stakeholders. And your vision speaks to the solving the problem of the financial burden of education for kids impacted by work-related injuries and fatalities. So understanding the impact of this disruption that we're seeing in the philanthropic space on your vision and grounding your mission around identifying opportunities resulting from it is really going to serve you well. Next slide, please. I mentioned individuals and families, and because it's a really fascinating time, and there's a lot of words on the page, but we're thinking about the second force, the demographic shift that's creating change. If you think about it, there are 5 generations operating simultaneously that are already or about to impact the flow of philanthropic capital. So this chart represents those 5 generations that are working together. And over the next 25 years, boomers are going to pass along nearly $48 trillion in assets to their heirs and to charity. And Generation X, I'm a Gen Xer, will be the biggest beneficiaries. I don't see that that 48 trillion headed in my direction, but for some lucky few out there, they will be the beneficiaries in the Gen X generation. Americans aged 50 plus to 70 are going to distribute some of those funds, it's estimated, while they're still alive in the form of gifts and charitable donations. And then the rest, they'll probably be transferring through bequests after their deaths. It's expected, though, that Gen Xers were going to replace boomers as the wealthiest generation over the next 25 years. So as you can imagine, from my perspective, this is a really challenging time for wealth managers and financial advisors, as each of these generations have different needs and different priorities. Boomers are shifting from this accumulation of asset stage to spending in their retirement while focusing on passing along their wealth to their families. Many in the Generation X group are entering their primary earning years and are planning for things like their children's education. Millennials, and the millennials are those aged 23 to 38, and not the kind of the teenage myth, this teenage cohort, I think that a lot of people consider them to be. Millennials are expected to outnumber baby boomers according to the Census Bureau projections. And the nation's 73 million millennials are the largest living adult generation. It's the next one, Gen Z, who are entering adulthood now. And each generation have characteristics that influence their giving very, very differently, generally speaking. We've seen it across the board with our wealth management clients. We've got the boomers who are figuring out how to try to take care of their parents and support their kids and their grandkids. So philanthropy is important, but so is the need for financial security for themselves and their families. With the Gen X generation, That generation is one of the most highly educated, with 35% of them having some post-secondary and advanced degrees. And they're also the most entrepreneurial, with 55% of all business startup founders in that Gen X space. But this is also the generation that saw the rise of women in corporate settings, and women are more likely to look for non-traditional ways to find solutions to problems. That extends to the way they give. We've all heard about giving circles, and they really became prolific over the past decade. And a recent survey showed that a survey respondents of over 700 giving circles with common gender identity, 91% of those giving circles were started and led by women. So women are on the forefront of thinking about ways to directly impact and make change with their giving. For millennials and Gen Z, they're most likely to bypass traditional giving altogether in favor of finding direct means for impact, usually using technology and the use of data. This is what we like to think of as the text to give generation. And the biggest mistake that many make in considering the youngest generation's philanthropy is assuming that they're uninformed and unengaged, when the reality is that they're both highly informed and highly motivated. These are the generations, they don't know of an analog world. Their entire lives, they've had access to the World Wide Web and virtual instantaneous information from a variety of sources. And they pay really close attention to impact. The questions they ask aren't just focused on, are you nonprofit focused on your mission? But their question actually are more around, does your mission even make a difference? So it's an entirely different way of thinking about giving. And we're sitting across the table and trying to navigate and find out how to maximize impact with all of these different priorities. For our individual and family clients, we do a lot of work in talking about philanthropy in terms of their family values. We start the conversation around philanthropy with the values of the family. And when you bring up values and what's important, legacy and impact with these different generations, the conversations around what to do with the money is wildly different depending on who has the floor at the time. How is change going to be funded by the members of these generations? And what does this mean for nonprofits? Are nonprofits prepared for these shifting priorities and these shifting dynamics in the approach in the way that folks give? Next slide, please. So when we think about demographic shifts, we also need to think about demographic shifts in the racial makeup of the US. It's expected by the year 2045 that non-Hispanic white people will be the minority of the population. And this chart here shows that back in 2015, philanthropy in terms of the dollars still looks like the US demographically 20 years ago. But there was a study back in 2019 by the Indiana University's Women's Philanthropy Institute, and that study revealed that all racial groups give at a substantial amount when viewed as a percentage of income as opposed to total dollars. There's really no significant difference between the charitable contributions by different racial groups when you take into consideration the percentage of income as compared to their giving. What is a differentiator is actually gender. Gender factored more heavily in the propensity to give than race, with single women donating more than single men. And I'll just add here, from a mortality perspective, single women generally live longer than single men and married women. I'll leave that without additional commentary. So with that lens, let's look at this chart differently. Instead of looking at this chart that shows that non-Hispanic white people give considerably more than underrepresented or people of color, how much opportunity is being untapped and focusing only or mostly on non-Hispanic white donors, and in particular, the big whales, the mega donors, instead of donors of color. So this is just a way of thinking about, a reminder that we need to think about a very holistic and a diverse approach in terms of giving and building networks and creating affinities for your organization, so that you won't be swept up and behind when these demographic shifts really take hold. Next slide, please. If we start going a little bit deeper into the dollars and cents of it, there's a study by donorsofcolor.org, and they do some quantification. There are over 1 million households led by a person of color with net liquid assets of 1 million or more. Net liquid assets of 1 million or more. And 25% of those reported net liquid assets over 30 million. Liquid assets. 54% of those said that they have assets between $1 and $10 million. So again, nonprofits would do well to consider how diversity and inclusion benefits the mission and build strategies with those principles as a key foundation. This isn't just from a financial capital perspective as well. This is also in terms of intellectual capital and human resources with respect to the workforce. A diverse and inclusive organization culturally brings new ideas, new perspectives, and really it statistically shows that they're much more successful in the long run. Next slide, please. So we talked about our accelerated disruption with COVID, tax, and social and racial justice initiatives. We've talked a little bit about the demographic shifts and how that's impacting the way that people give and impacting with the way that organizations should think about in a holistic and inclusive approach to giving. So let's talk now about the final force creating change in the growth, and that's the growth in social investing. I talked about the $449 billion in giving and how that was an historic number in the history of giving in the US. But in a 10-year period ending in 2019, it was the impact investing marketplace that blew everything out of the water. That 10-year period ending 2019, the impact investing marketplace was over $700 billion. So when you compare, it took, many decades to get charitable giving in the traditional sense to 449 billion. It's only taken 10 years for an impact investing marketplace to exceed 700 billion. So just so we're speaking the same language, what do I mean by impact investing? Simply put, impact investing is investing with the intention of making a positive and measurable social and environmental impact while getting some type of financial return. So to put it even more plainly, it's doing well by doing good. Earlier, I talked about how the different generations and approach philanthropy and how non-traditional approaches to find solutions are particularly of interest for the Gen Xers and those younger generations. And again, this is where some generational assumptions may be misleading, because you don't get to a $700 billion marketplace with just young people. There's really some sophisticated and savvy and experienced investors that are taking that investor savviness and applying that to their philanthropic efforts. And what's really great about this approach is that this is not a threat to traditional philanthropy, and it's not a threat for nonprofits. It actually creates this tremendous opportunity for nonprofits to meet donors where they are and offer flexibility, and also pursue a variety of different revenue streams. So it's important to remember that impact or social investing in traditional philanthropy, it's not a zero-sum game. It's both and not either or. So this chart here shows the social investing continuum from traditional nonprofits and for-profits, and how everything in between are the various ways or the various levers that nonprofits and donors can pull to make an impact. So let's just say a donor wants to make an impact in education. And they may come to a nonprofit like Kids Chance and say, hey, you guys are doing some really, really great work in helping kids achieve their educational goals. But what I really care about, and the problem that I want to really find a solution for, is thinking about the educational goals of kids with special needs. I've been following this company and I'm thinking about investing with them. And this company builds these tremendous online learning tools for kids with limited physical abilities. And I'm thinking about investing, but what I want to make sure of before I do is that these kids get access to these tools as they're produced. The kids who need the tools get access to them. So Kids Chance, how might we work together to make sure that that happens? So this is an example of a for-profit social venture. And all that means is this is an investment for the donor. They're expecting to invest in a company that's going to with the intention of making money. But it also has a direct social impact for these kids who really could use these tools. And it also allows the nonprofit to grow support for their mission. I mean, if you think about it, there's a pretty strong chance that someone who approaches an organization for an opportunity like this has a strong enough affinity to the organization to support in more traditional ways. And it's also they're probably also highly likely to serve as a strong ambassador, because the nonprofit success is also going to drive success for the firm that they're invested in. So again, this is both and this is where donors are moving. And this is where also nonprofits need to be prepared to meet them there. So I'm going to stop here and take a couple of moments before I kind of wrap up with some talk about board governance. And let's look at the chat if you have any questions or any comments. I'm happy to answer anything that we've covered so far.
Crystal, we don't have anything in the chat so far.
Okay. All right. So you all are a brilliant crowd, and I've covered everything well. So you're keeping track. All right. So next slide, please. So this is the slide that we talk about where meeting donors where they are and positioning your organization to meet them there. So how do you get there? And this is where you need to start thinking about strategy of aligning your mission with your deployment of resources in a prudent and responsible way, or what's more simply or commonly known as enterprise risk management. This is where the rubber really meets the road. And as we think about the future of giving and the impact to nonprofits, this is where the focus is going to be in decision-making. So we think about things like short versus long-term strategy. And I like to think about this as if you don't know where you're going, then any road will take you there. So you really need to think about both, not just the immediate needs from a short-term strategy, but examine the current state, especially amid this industry disruption, and assessing your approach both from a short-term and a long-term perspective. As a wealth management firm, we spend a lot of time talking about investments. We spend a lot of time talking about investments with nonprofits, but it's certainly not all about the investments. It's about all of the organization's resources, intellectual and human resources. It's about your approach to fundraising and the investment in it. But also, what are the sources of revenue beyond fundraising? This left side of the page, when we talk about governance and leadership retention, these are pretty standard questions that successful nonprofits consider often. But this right side, these are the hard questions. And these are the more challenging ones because they speak to the types of issues that explore the foundation of every organization. So questions like, do the board and staff leadership work well together and have a healthy relationship? Some of the ideas that I've talked about today could be considered somewhat controversial to some, or just even a departure from the status quo. In order to be successful in addressing the challenges of the future, the ability to discuss these types of issues, and even more importantly, make sound decisions collectively in support of the mission, can hinge on the board staff relationship. So it's important to consider a diversity of perspectives as well. And not just diversity in terms of racial diversity, but diversity across the board, expertise, ages, backgrounds. All of those different types of perspectives can help to inform decisions and really lead to some innovative and collaborative thinking. Then, of course, there's the collaboration between fundraising and finance, or what I like to think of as the attempt to dance backwards and in heels, because there's this inherent tension sometimes between fundraising and finance. There in the sense that finance is trying to be prudent stewards of the financial obligations and commitments of the organization, while fundraising is just doing everything that they can to bring money in the door in support of the mission and steward their donors. But at the end of the day, it's the mission that matters. Everybody is working towards the same goal. So there's a need for fundraising and finance to collaborate and appreciate each other and work well together and stay focused on that mission. So considering things like, is the finance team open to a discussion on spending to raise fundraising capacity? Over the past year, we stopped personal contact with people. We weren't going out and meeting people. We weren't seeing people in person. The nonprofits who had strong digital marketing, they were able to pivot quickly, while others were really, quite frankly, trying to build the plane while flying the plane. And then there's other nonprofits who relied solely on one or two big annual galas or events for the majority of their fundraisings, particularly their unrestricted funds. And then in light of COVID, when we couldn't meet in person, those organizations really struggle to find alternative revenue streams, especially to meet unrestricted need, to meet needs with unrestricted funding. They really struggled. So there's a lot of lessons that we learned from the impact of the pandemic. And one of the biggest lessons that we learned is that returning to operating exactly as we did before, it's not going to lead to long-term success. Instead, what we need to do is we need to learn what worked. We need to learn from the things that we took on as a challenge, but ended up being a great opportunity and ended up leading to successful ventures. And then we need to think about how to adapt those opportunities. We need to think about how to adapt those into a longer term strategy. The other thing that we need to do is we need to be honest and candid about what didn't work. And all the things that didn't work, we need to leave those behind. We need to learn from those failures, have discussions around them, and then we need to leave them in the past and build towards future success, leaving that in the dust. When we think about the forces of change, there's a lot here. The ultimate reality is that we need to consider an investment in the future in order to respond to the future of giving. So I think I saw some chat questions, and I'm gonna pause here and ask Linda to help me out and let me know what people are thinking in the chat box.
All right, and we have about 5 minutes left. So we have one question here. We saw an increase in giving for 2020. What do you anticipate we'll see in 2021 and 2022? Will we see a sustained increase?
I think that's a good question, and I think I'm hopeful and optimistic we are that the giving pace will continue. I think that there is going to be some hesitation again as we think about kind of tax legislation and how that's going to impact charitable giving. But for the most part, I'm certainly optimistic. I'll share that so far this year, we've seen a tremendous ramp up already. Typically, we wouldn't see this type of ramp up until mid-year, June, July, but we've already started to see many, many more gifts coming in. Our January wasn't as busy as our December, but it was still pretty busy for January. So I think that while tax legislation may make donors pump the brakes a little bit in thinking about what that impact is going to be. I think that the generosity that we saw in 2020 and moving out of kind of the pandemic and moving and looking for ways to address some of the challenges that arose from the pandemic, I think that could lead to sustained giving in 2021.
All right, let me stop my share so that people can see you. You've finished your slides. And so the other question was, what should nonprofit boards pay attention to in particular with regard to their donors, especially corporate partners? And then maybe a related question is, how do we as a state organization leverage our boards in fundraising efforts?
So first things first, your board are your best and greatest ambassadors. Your board know the organization in and out. They have not just an affinity to the mission, but they're stewards of the organization. So they are your greatest ambassadors. And if you haven't put them in front of people or gotten them involved in fundraising efforts, I strongly encourage you to do so. I think sometimes, I serve on a couple of different boards, and I think sometimes, the boards can be so focused on the good work and the mission and stewardship of the organization's assets and resources, that sometimes our fundraising partners forget that, hey, we're members of this board because we care about the work, we care about the people, we want to be out there with you helping to spread the message of the mission and the good work. So reach out and find ways to involve your board as ambassadors, whether it's picking up the phone and talking to donors and key donors and volunteers, or we at one of the boards I served on, we did a short little video thanking our volunteers directly from the board, and that was just a small way to get them involved. But think of ways to do that. From the board's perspective, for the first part of the question, in thinking about the board in terms of key things that need to be a focus, I think consideration on how people are giving and how to maximize those opportunities to give and leverage all of the different ways that people want to and can give. The example that I gave are those partnerships and strategic collaborations. There needs to be an understanding of the organization's the commitment and willingness to consider those types of opportunities. And you need to do that before the opportunity arises, right? You need, because I will tell you, folks that have this kind of entrepreneurial way of thinking about philanthropy, they tend to want to, they want to get the ball rolling, and you don't want to have the board kind of caught flat-footed in considering different types of opportunities or different ways to think about revenue streams and fundraising in a non-traditional sense. But you don't want to get caught flat-footed. Your board should be thinking about what types of opportunities that they would want to consider as a part of a longer term strategy, and then putting the guardrails and putting the fiduciary due diligence in place so that they can address these opportunities as they come about.
Thank you, Crystal. That wraps up the questions we have. So I think Vicki is going to come back on. Vicki?
I'm on. Thanks, Crystal. That was great. That was really terrific. Just some of the guidance about what we can look for in donors and donations, and I think particularly the role of the board in fundraising. And what I really took away was the kinds of things that donors are looking for in nonprofit organizations. And I think some of that we really need to pay attention to as we begin to strategically move along. So thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Let's give her a virtual round of applause to Crystal.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for being here. Now, I understand from Linda, we are going to try the student spotlight again. Yes, with all success. So I'm not going to set it up again, but take it away, Linda.
It's time for another student spotlight today, or this time we're with Allie McCrae, who comes to us from the Kids Chance of Pennsylvania organization. I'm going to start off just by asking you to tell us a little bit about what brought you to Kids Chance and how you found us, what brought you to our organization.
The reason that I found Kids Chance was because I was struggling and figuring out how I was going to pay for my tuition. And my mom kind of looked online and she said, look, you're applicable for this because my dad had a work-related injury. So I applied for the scholarship and then I got it for sophomore year, junior year, and senior year. And I'm so thankful because it really made a huge impact on my undergraduate career. So I went to Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and I got a Bachelor of Music degree. And after I graduated, I went on to my graduate degree at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I am now a board certified music therapist, and I'm graduating with my Master of Music Therapy after 3 years. So it's my hope to use music as means for helping people overcome various health and educational problems. And it's been really rewarding. And thanks to the scholarship that I had an undergraduate degree, it made obtaining a master's degree a little bit more tangible for me because the financials were definitely something I had to think about before I decided to pursue higher education. So 2020 was a pretty tough year for my family. In June of 2020, I lost my dad. He had been in the hospital for 14 months prior to his death. And so he spent a lot of time prior to COVID in the hospital. And then when COVID hit, we couldn't see him. So the last day that I actually got to see him was the day that he died. And I hadn't seen him for 3 months. So that definitely took a huge toll on my family. And before he died in January of 2020, my mom had gotten diagnosed with cancer. So my siblings and I were kind of simultaneously dealing with 2 sick parents. I was navigating graduate school. My siblings were in their senior year of high school. They're twins. And then after my dad passed, things started to get a little bit better on the COVID ends. And then my mom got diagnosed with COVID. So she was simultaneously going through chemotherapy treatment, had COVID, and luckily she was able to recover. And now she just had surgery not long ago and she's doing great. So yeah, despite the challenges of 2020, we came out doing okay.
So thank you, Allie. My goodness, just I think more challenges than any one student should be able to face, but we really thank you. And thank you for being there. And Bob, thank you for doing that. Thanks, Kathy. Oh, that's great. So we're helping the family. That's great. We're going to take 5 or 4. We will begin immediately at 1 p.m. with our next panel discussion on nonprofit corporate responsibility. But this is an opportunity for everyone to stretch, grab something to eat or drink, or visit the restroom, and we'll come back at you in 5.